I remember the exact sound the keys made when they hit my desk. A sharp metallic crack against the glass top, like he was trying to leave a mark on something that belonged to me. Chadwick Rooney didn't slide them across politely, didn't set them down the way a reasonable person hands something over. He tossed them from about 3 feet away, a lazy flick of the wrist, the kind of gesture that said he had done this 100 times and fully expected me to scramble to catch whatever he threw. I didn't scramble. I let the keys land, let them slide 2 inches toward the edge of my desk, and I looked up at him with the kind of steady patience that I'd been building for 11 months. My name is Waverly Cousins. I am 34 years old, and at the time of that moment, I was a senior loan recovery specialist at Meridian Capital Group, a mid-sized financial services firm headquartered in Charlotte, North Carolina. My job, in the plainest possible terms, was to manage the back end of defaulted auto loans, which meant documentation, compliance, legal coordination, and when it came to it, working with licensed recovery agents to facilitate the repossession of collateral. I had been doing this work for 6 years. I was good at it. Not just competent, but the kind of good that came from genuinely understanding every layer of the process, from the original loan instruments to the state-specific repossession statutes to the way a debtor's attorney would try to find a procedural crack in your paperwork. I knew where the cracks were because I had spent years making sure there weren't any in mine. Chadwick Rooney had taken out a $280,000 secured loan through Meridian Capital 18 months before that morning. The collateral was a 2023 Bentley Continental GT, pearl white with a saddle interior, a car he had driven off the lot the same day. He signed the paperwork like the ink was already dry in his imagination before the meeting even started. He was the kind of man who moved through transactions that way, as though the outcome was already settled, and the process was just a formality the universe owed him. He owned a chain of 7 luxury car wash and detailing facilities across the Charlotte metro area, branded under the name Rooney Prestige Auto Spa, and at the time he came to us, he had strong revenue numbers, a clean business credit profile, and a personal net worth that, on paper, made the loan look like a rounding error. We approved it. We processed it. We sent him a beautiful packet with the loan documents, the repayment schedule, the insurance requirements, all of it neat and organized. He probably used it as a coaster. He made his first payment on time. His second, too. By the 4th month, he started running about 2 weeks late, which triggered a soft flag in our system, but not a serious one. Plenty of high-balance borrowers did this, and as long as they caught up, it was a pattern we monitored rather than escalated. But Chadwick didn't catch up. He started running a month behind, then 6 weeks, and somewhere around the 8-month mark, his assistant began calling us on his behalf to request extensions, always with a different reason. The car wash industry was being hit hard by a drought water restriction ordinance. A key location had pipe damage. A licensing dispute with the city had temporarily impacted one of their flagship sites. Every explanation was plausible. Every explanation was delivered with the casual confidence of a man who had never once been told that his reasons weren't good enough. I was assigned as lead on the Rooney account at the 9-month mark, when it officially crossed into our escalated recovery portfolio. My supervisor, a meticulous woman named Dorothea Marsh who had been in financial services for 22 years and had the kind of institutional memory that made her borderline impossible to surprise, handed me the file with a single sentence. She said, "He's going to be charming and he's going to be late, and eventually he's going to try to make this your problem." I took the file, read every page of it that evening at my kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea, and I went in the next morning with a complete picture of exactly where we stood. 3 payments behind. Multiple extension requests granted by the previous account manager, one of which had not been properly documented in our system. Insurance lapsed for 46 days earlier in the year and reinstated only after we sent a formal cure notice. The pattern was clear, even if no single piece of it was catastrophic on its own. I called Chadwick Rooney on a Tuesday morning at 9:15. He picked up on the 4th ring and answered with the energy of someone who had been expecting a much more interesting call. When I introduced myself and explained that I was taking over management of his account, he did something that I would come to recognize as one of his signature moves. He laughed. Not a mean laugh, not an embarrassed one, but the easy, rolling laugh of a man who considered all of this a mild inconvenience that would resolve itself the moment he decided to let it. He told me he was glad to finally have someone new on the file because the last person, no offense to her, just hadn't understood the complexity of his business cycle. I told him I had reviewed the entire account history and was looking forward to working with him toward resolution. He said, "Great, great, let's get lunch sometime and talk through it." I said I appreciated the offer and suggested instead that we schedule a formal account review call for later that week. There was a pause, brief but noticeable, and then he said, "Sure, have his assistant set it up." His assistant, a young man named Trevor who always sounded slightly apologetic when he called, set up the review for that Friday afternoon. Chadwick joined 11 minutes late, breezy about it, and spent the first portion of the call explaining the broader economic headwinds facing the car detailing industry in a way that suggested he had prepared talking points. I let him finish. Then I walked him through the account status line by line, the outstanding balance, the days past due, the prior extensions and their terms, the insurance lapse documentation. I was pleasant. I was precise. And I made sure that by the end of the call, Chadwick Rooney understood two things clearly. First, that I had read everything, and second, that I was not going to be managed. He committed to a partial payment by the following Wednesday and a full catch-up plan within 30 days. I sent a written summary of the call with those commitments outlined and asked him to confirm receipt. Trevor confirmed it by email 40 minutes later. The partial payment came through on Thursday, one day late, for 2/3 of the amount he had committed to. I documented it, applied it to the account, and sent a polite follow-up noting the discrepancy and reiterating the 30-day catch-up timeline. Chadwick responded personally to that one, which was unusual. He said the remainder would be there by end of week and that he appreciated my patience. The remainder did not come by end of week. It did not come the week after. What came instead, on a gray Wednesday morning about 3 weeks into my management of his account, was Chadwick Rooney himself, in person, unannounced, at our Charlotte office. Our receptionist, a sharp woman named Gemma Ford who had seen every variety of difficult visitor in her 8 years at the front desk, called back to let me know that a Mr. Rooney was here and asking to speak with whoever was handling his loan. I told her to let him know I'd be right out. I took 2 minutes to pull up his file on my laptop, confirm where the account stood that morning, and make a note in the system that he had arrived unannounced. Then I walked out to the lobby. He was exactly what his file had prepared me for. Tall, well-dressed in the particular way of a man who had recently discovered Italian tailoring and was still excited about it, with the easy physical confidence of someone accustomed to being the most prosperous person in most rooms. He was holding a coffee from the expensive place 2 blocks down, and he smiled when he saw me with the specific warmth of a person who uses warmth as a tool. He said, "Waverly, great to put a face to the voice." I shook his hand, told him it was good to meet him, and led him back to one of our small conference rooms rather than to my desk. That was deliberate. A conference room is neutral ground with a door. My desk is my workspace, and I don't conduct difficult account conversations there if I can help it. We sat down, and he went into his pitch almost immediately. He told me that he had some significant news on the business side, that one of the major national car care franchise groups had approached him about acquiring the Rooney Prestige locations, and that he was in early-stage talks that he believed would result in a transaction closing within 90 days. He said that once that closed, the loan would be paid in full, and that he was asking for a 90-day forbearance to bridge that gap. He delivered all of this with the momentum of a man who believed the story itself was persuasive enough to carry the ask. I listened to every word of it without interrupting. When he finished, I said, "I appreciate you coming in to share that, and I understand what you're describing. What I need to ask is whether you have anything in writing from the acquiring party that I could include in your file, a letter of intent, a term sheet, even an email exchange that confirms the conversation is active." The warmth shifted slightly. Not gone, but recalibrated. He said that at this stage the discussions were confidential, and putting anything in writing could complicate the deal. I nodded and told him I understood the sensitivity of that, and that I wasn't asking him to share anything proprietary, just some form of documentation that I could present to my team when making the case for a forbearance agreement. He said he would see what he could do. I told him that without documentation, a 90-day forbearance would be very difficult to approve through our process, and that in the meantime the account continued to accrue under its existing terms. He looked at me for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating, and then he smiled again, broader this time, and said, "You're good at this." I thanked him and told him I'd be in touch as soon as I heard back from him on the documentation. He never sent the documentation. What he sent instead, over the next 3 weeks, was a series of increasingly creative communications, a voicemail from him saying the deal had hit a minor snag but was still moving, an email from Trevor attaching what appeared to be a one-page summary document that had no letterhead, no signatory, and no contact information for the alleged acquiring company, and then a phone call during which Chadwick told me that he had spoken with someone at the executive level at our firm, a name he dropped that I recognized as one of our regional vice presidents, and that this individual had indicated some flexibility might be available. I thanked him for the update and told him I would follow up internally. Then I walked directly to Dorothea's office and told her what he had said. Dorothea looked at me over her reading glasses with the expression she reserved for things that were not surprising but were still tiresome. She told me she had received no such call and had authorized no such flexibility. She said she would make a note of it. I went back to my desk and documented the conversation in the account file with timestamps and exact language. I had learned early in this work that the file is everything. Whatever ends up mattering, whatever a lawyer or a regulator or a senior manager eventually needs to look at, it is all in the file. My files were organized, detailed, and current. Chadwick Rooney's account file by this point was one of the most comprehensively documented in my portfolio. At the 11-month mark, the account crossed the threshold that triggered mandatory escalation to formal default proceedings under Meridian's internal policy. This was not a discretionary call. It was a defined metric, a specific combination of days past due, outstanding balance, and broken repayment commitments, and Chadwick Rooney had cleared every one of them. I prepared the formal default notice, had it reviewed by our in-house counsel, a careful and methodical attorney named Prescott Ingram, who communicated exclusively in precise declarative sentences and had strong opinions about comma placement in legal documents, and sent it via certified mail to both Chadwick's home address and his registered business address. I also emailed it directly and noted in the file that delivery had been confirmed. The default notice gave him 15 days to cure the default by bringing the account fully current or to contact us to discuss formal workout options. It also included the standard language advising that failure to cure could result in repossession of the secured collateral in accordance with North Carolina law. I had drafted this language so many times over the years that I could probably have written it from memory, but I always pulled the template and compared it line by line anyway, because Prescott had once spent 40 minutes explaining to me why the word may versus will in a repossession notice had different legal weight depending on the circuit, and I had never forgotten it. Chadwick called me the morning after the certified mail was delivered. He was not breezy this time. He was controlled, but there was an edge underneath it. Something harder than the easy charm he usually led with. He said he felt blindsided. I told him, as calmly and factually as I could, that the account had been in escalating delinquency for 7 months, that we had held 2 formal account review calls, that 3 extension requests had been processed and not fulfilled, and that the default notice was required by our policy at this stage and had been preceded by multiple written advisories. He said he had people looking at this from a legal standpoint. I told him that was absolutely his right, and that any communications from legal counsel could be directed to Prescott Ingram's office, whose contact information was included in the notice. He said he expected more flexibility from an institution that had benefited from his business. I told him that I understood his frustration and that I hoped he would take the 15-day cure window seriously, because that was genuinely the best path forward for both parties. He did not cure within 15 days. On day 12, his attorney, a fast-talking Charlotte litigator named Brackett Sims who appeared to specialize in buying time for clients who had run out of legitimate options, sent a letter to Prescott claiming a procedural defect in the default notice based on an argument about the timing of a prior extension agreement and its impact on the default calculation. Prescott read the letter, was quiet for a moment, and then sent back a 5-paragraph response so precisely constructed that when I read it, I actually felt a small, quiet satisfaction that I kept entirely to myself. The alleged defect was not a defect. The extension agreement had been documented correctly, the calculation was accurate, and the notice was valid. Sims did not respond to Prescott's letter. On day 16, with the cure window expired and no payment received, I initiated the repossession authorization process. This involved a formal internal approval chain, my recommendation, Dorothea's sign-off, and a final review by Prescott to confirm the legal clearance, and coordination with one of our licensed recovery vendors, a firm we worked with regularly whose professionalism I had always appreciated. The logistics of an actual repossession were not my direct responsibility once the authorization was in place. I handed off to the recovery team with a complete file and clear documentation of the collateral's last known location, which was Chadwick's register home address in the Ballantyne area of Charlotte, where the Bentley had been photographed in the driveway by a field agent during a routine address verification 2 weeks earlier. And then, on the morning of day 17, before the recovery had been executed, Chadwick Rooney walked back into our office. Gemma called back again. I pulled up the file, made a note of his arrival, and walked out to meet him. He was dressed differently this time, not the Italian tailoring but something more casual, though still expensive, the kind of casual that cost as much as most people's formal wear. He asked if we could talk privately. I led him back to the same conference room. He sat down, and for a long moment he didn't say anything. Then he said that he wanted to resolve this. I told him I was glad to hear that, and asked what he had in mind. He said he had spoken with a private lender who could bridge him for 60 days, and that he was prepared to make a significant payment today if we would stand down the repossession order. I told him that I appreciated him coming in and that a payment would absolutely be applied to the account, but that the repossession authorization was already in process, and the only way to fully stop it was to bring the account to current status in full, not a partial payment, but the complete outstanding amount including the accrued default interest. He looked at me for another moment, and then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out his car keys, the Bentley key fob, a heavy, expensive thing with the winged B embossed on it, and he tossed them onto my desk. He said, "Fine, take it, since that's apparently what you need to do." The tone was theatrical, designed to make me feel like the villain of a story he was already narrating in his head. I looked at the keys on my desk. I looked at him. I said, "Mr. Rooney, I want to make sure you understand what you're doing. A voluntary surrender is a formal action. It doesn't eliminate the deficiency balance, the difference between what the vehicle sells for at auction and the remaining loan amount. You would still owe that balance, and it would be pursued through our standard collections process." He waved his hand. He said he knew what he was doing and that he just wanted this over with. I said, "I want to make sure this is documented clearly. I'm going to note in the file that you have voluntarily surrendered the collateral, the date and time, and that you were advised of the deficiency balance implications. Are you confirming that's your intention?" He said yes. I made the note in real time on my laptop, right there in the conference room, with the timestamp visible. I picked up the keys. I held them for a moment, that heavy, expensive fob, still warm from his jacket pocket, and I said I would process the surrender and that he would receive written confirmation of the next steps, including the auction timeline and deficiency calculation, within 5 business days. He stood up, straightened his jacket, and left without another word. I sat in the conference room for about 30 seconds after he walked out, not because I needed to collect myself, but because I had learned that the 30 seconds after a difficult conversation are a good time to make sure you haven't missed anything. Then I walked back to my desk and started the voluntary surrender paperwork. The Bentley sold at auction 22 days later for $198,000. The remaining loan balance at that point, including accrued interest and default fees, was $241,600. That left a deficiency balance of $43,600, which was referred to our collections division with a complete file. Sims sent one more letter, this one arguing that the auction process had not been conducted in a commercially reasonable manner and that his client disputed the deficiency. Prescott reviewed the auction documentation, confirmed that everything had been handled correctly and in full compliance with North Carolina's Article 9 requirements, and sent back a response that was, if anything, even more precise than the last one. We did not hear from Sims again after that. I heard through a colleague who did business development in the Charlotte market that the Rooney Prestige Auto Spa acquisition deal had apparently never been real, or rather, It had been real in the sense that someone had expressed casual interest once at a networking event, and Chadwick had built an entire narrative around that conversation that he may or may not have genuinely believed himself. 2 of his 7 locations closed within the following year. The remaining 5 were eventually sold, though not to the national franchise group he had described, and not for the kind of number that would have made any of it a rounding error. I thought about Chadwick Rooney more than I probably should have in the weeks after that file closed. Not with satisfaction, exactly, though I won't pretend there wasn't a quiet and professional version of satisfaction in having handled it correctly from beginning to end. What I thought about more was the specific texture of the way men like him moved through financial spaces, the assumption that charm was a form of currency, that being impressive was the same as being creditworthy, that the rules applied differently to people who carried themselves a certain way. I had seen it before, and I would see it again. What I had also seen consistently was that the rules did not actually apply differently. The loan documents said what they said. The repayment schedule said what it said. The collateral was the collateral. There's a version of this story where I am cast as cold, or where the institution I work for is cast as heartless, and I understand why that version exists. Debt and default and repossession are genuinely hard things, and behind every account in my portfolio, there was a real person in a real financial difficulty that had, at some point, been something other than a line item. I carried that awareness with me. But I also carried the awareness that Chadwick Rooney had borrowed $280,000, had made choices about how to manage his business and his obligations, had received more extensions and more patient conversations than many borrowers in more desperate circumstances ever got, and had spent a year attempting to use his personality to substitute for accountability. The keys landing on my desk with that sharp crack were not the ending of the story. They were just a dramatic gesture from a man who had run out of other moves. The ending of the story was quieter than that. It was paperwork. It was a completed file, clean and thorough from the first soft flag to the final deficiency letter. It was Dorothea stopping by my desk a week after the surrender to tell me I had handled the Rooney account well, in the measured tone she used for things she considered genuinely notable. It was Gemma at the front desk giving me a small nod when she heard the file had closed, because Gemma noticed everything and forgot nothing. It was me driving home that evening on I-485 with the radio off, thinking about nothing in particular, feeling the specific quiet that comes after you have done a difficult thing correctly. I have the Bentley key fob on my desk still. Not as a trophy, that would be strange, but because after the voluntary surrender was processed, it ended up in the collateral intake bag, and then, through a small administrative gap that I am technically responsible for, it was never forwarded to the auction facility. I found it in my desk drawer about 6 weeks after the file closed. I meant to send it along. I kept meaning to. At some point I stopped meaning to and just let it stay. It sits in the corner of my top drawer next to a spare phone charger and a box of paper clips, and every so often my hand lands on it when I'm reaching for something else, and I feel that weight, heavy, deliberate, expensive, and I think about the sound it made when it hit my desk, and I think about how certain he was in that moment that he was the one walking away from a situation.
He was wrong about that.
He was wrong about a lot of things. But that one in particular, I have found, tends to stay with me.